Hey, Pretty Girl Club. So, I wanted to destroy some more hypocritical talking points today. Have you ever noticed that when unambiguous black women talk about light skin privilege, like when you ask them to describe light skin privilege and when they have witnessed it, they actually start describing pretty privilege? For example, they will say things like, I went into the bar with my light skinned friend, and all the guys at the bar looked at her. That is not light skin privilege. That's called pretty privilege. Pretty privilege is, when eyes are on you or you're getting attention for your beauty or whatever. And then another thing that I've heard women say is, oh, I photoshopped my picture on a dating app and made myself light skinned, and then people gave me attention and they asked me on dates. Being asked on a date, not light skin privilege. Dating is not something that is described as light skin privilege. For those of you who think that I'm lying right now, let's go ahead and go to a racial and ethnic studies academic journal to look at the actual definition of light skin privilege. Light skin privilege is a term that is often used to describe the relative advantages that racially minoritized people who are socially recognized as light skinned receive when navigating predominantly white spaces compared to their peers with darker skin. It says nothing about dating apps, says nothing about getting chosen for marriage, says nothing about guys looking at you at a bar, says nothing about Instagram likes. This definition is actually talking about navigating white spaces. So predominantly white spaces would be like the court system. You know how they say this person who did the same crime, they got less time in jail or whatever. Okay, so I can see how you can make that argument. But simply being called beautiful or getting guys looking at you in a bar or having more matches on a dating app or getting married or just being viewed as pretty or having other people want to look like you or having access to more dating options, having access to maybe a higher earning man. Have you ever noticed that when women start describing light skin privilege, they start describing pretty privilege? People were looking at her in high school. Everybody said that she was beautiful. Everybody was complimenting her. When we were kids, people were complimenting her and they were not complimenting me. So once again, receiving compliments, that's a form of pretty privilege. You know what? As a matter of fact, let's look up the definition of pretty privilege. Pretty privilege is an unearned and mostly unacknowledged societal advantage that a person has by fitting into the beauty standards of their culture. Doesn't say anything about beauty standards of white culture. Doesn't say anything about beauty standards of black culture. It just says fitting into beauty standards of their culture. So this is proof that a lot of the women who describe light skin privilege are actually describing pretty privilege. So for all the people who come onto my channel and say, well, you're conflating pretty privilege with looking a certain way. Well, guess what? That's because according to dictionary.com, pretty privilege is an unacknowledged societal advantage that a person has by fitting into the beauty standards of their culture. So guess what? If you want to make light-skinned black women the beauty standard of the black culture, then you can't get mad when light-skinned women experience pretty privilege. This is pretty privilege. And by the way, I do want to make it clear that I'm not saying that light-skinned women are the only ones who experience pretty privilege. Any woman of any shade can experience pretty privilege. Dark-skinned women can experience pretty privilege. I talk about that on this channel all the time. But have you ever noticed that when unambiguous people describe light-skin privilege, they begin describing pretty privilege? So saying things like, you get free drinks at the bar, for example. That's not colorism. That's pretty privilege. That just means your friend has pretty privilege and you don't have pretty privilege. Dark-skinned women with pretty privilege, they get free drinks at the bar. Dark-skinned women with pretty privilege walk into the bar and people look at them too. Dark-skinned women with pretty privilege, they get opportunities in Hollywood too. They get called pretty too. They have dating options as well. They get likes on dating apps as well. So this is what I'm talking about when I say that a lot of Black empowerment content creators don't understand definitions, because when you ask them, hey, what privileges do light-skinned women have that you don't have? And they'll begin describing pretty privilege. They'll talk about dating options. They'll talk about how they get compliments and stuff. So they don't realize that by saying that, though, they're admitting that they themselves don't have pretty privilege. I've noticed that a lot of unambiguous Black women conflate light-skinned and mixed privilege with pretty privilege. If you don't believe me, that's fine. I've got plenty of screenshots to prove what I'm saying. Number one, Black Ladies Reddit. She says, mixed and light skin privilege is actually insane. Not to state the obvious, but I just realized how serious this really is. There are certain celebs that everyone loves simply because they are mixed and light skinned and pretty. I am not going to say any names, but the most recent one would obviously be Ice Spice. I'm not one of her haters, but the opportunities and hype she's gotten in such a short amount of time is crazy. Like, I'm happy for her, but that's insane. Every time I hear people talking about a pretty, mixed, or light skinned celeb, at some point the conversation will be about her looks, or criticism will end with, but she's cute though. There's even certain actresses I could name. This is not me saying they're not talented or hating, but it's mind blowing. I mean, I love to see black women win regardless, but what the F? Okay, so you admitted yourself that you're not saying they're not talented. So you're admitting that women like Ice Spice are talented. And what you're calling mixed and light skin privilege is that people say they're cute. Saying that a light skinned woman is cute is not colorist. Being called cute or pretty by millions of people, that's not light skin privilege. That's pretty privilege. Ice Spice has pretty privilege. Beyonce has pretty privilege. All these women, like all these actresses and stuff, they have pretty privilege. But guess what? So do the dark skinned actresses with pretty privilege. They get called pretty too. Lupita Nyong'o gets called pretty. So why is it that if a light skinned girl is called pretty, it's automatically just because she's mixed or light skinned? That's you guys that are conflating mixed and light skin privilege with pretty privilege. If you don't believe me, let's take a look at some more screenshots. This person says, I am bamboozled by the Ice Spice thing. Like, the assumption that the Drake lyric is about her is just baffling to me. She is not what I'd consider a 10, and I feel like I'm living in the Twilight Zone with so many people entertaining the idea that his lyrics were about her. Okay, being called a 10, that's not light skin privilege, that's pretty privilege. So do you see how they conflate light skin and mixed privilege with pretty privilege? So being called a 10 is somehow colorist, being called pretty is somehow colorist. And it's like, no, it's not. It's literally, she has pretty privilege. People think that she is pretty. Now, if people think she's pretty because she is light-skinned, and then they say she is pretty because she's light-skinned and so is not pretty because they are dark-skinned, yes, you could say that that's absolutely colorism. But simply calling Ice Spice pretty, that's not colorist. Somebody calling a woman a 10 who happens to have a light skin tone, that's not colorist. And so do you see what I mean with them constantly conflating light skin privilege, mixed race privilege? They conflate it with pretty privilege. Because every time you ask them to describe, okay, how does this person have light skin privilege? Like, what exactly is the privilege? Oh, the privilege is that she got called a 10 in a Drake song. Oh, the privilege is that people, they compliment her more. The privilege is that she gets likes on dating apps. That's just good old fashioned pretty privilege. Anybody who's pretty will get likes on dating apps. They will get people calling them pretty, and they'll have people looking at them in the bar. This person says, Ice Spice to me is the very definition of someone being considered pretty because she is light skinned, because she doesn't have the features to be pretty to me. Okay, so we all know that Ice Spice has non-white features. So this person is revealing that they believe white features are pretty, or, features that are a little bit less African looking are pretty. So again, this is somebody in the Black Ladies Reddit saying this. So is she a futurist or what? You tell me. But also, even if someone does consider a person's skin tone to be pretty, like if they consider dark-skinned girls to be pretty, light-skinned girls to be pretty, white girls to be pretty. Again, why is it okay if somebody thinks that dark-skinned girls are pretty, but then suddenly it's not okay if somebody thinks light-skinned girls are pretty? Why don't you keep the same energy with white women? I don't see people going on to country music websites where they're talking about blue-eyed blondes and then saying, oh, you guys are being racist. And also, it's like, just because you don't think that Ice Spice is pretty, it doesn't mean that she's not pretty. You get to decide within yourself whether you think you're pretty, and also other people can pick and choose whether or not they want to compliment you. So just because you don't view her as pretty, this doesn't mean that it doesn't take away her pretty privilege, is what I'm trying to say. And a lot of times when these women describe light skin privilege or mixed privilege, like what they're trying to do with Ice Spice, they're simply describing pretty privilege, and they don't even realize it because a lot of women don't know the actual definitions of light skin privilege and pretty privilege. Pretty privilege means that you are being praised for your beauty. Light skin privilege means that you are having an easier time navigating in white spaces. So two things can be true at the same time, though. People can have light skin privilege and pretty privilege. And so this is why I tend to have a problem when people say she only got to where she is because she's light skinned, because light skin privilege is not the only thing that takes people to, like, let's say Ice Spice's level or Beyonce's level. Beyonce, for example, you can say she has light skin privilege. Yeah, sure. But she also has pretty privilege. She has wealth privilege. She has education privilege. She's obviously privileged in terms of talent. So the same thing can be said for Ice Spice. And so that's why I tend to argue back on this channel when people say things like, she only got to where she is because of her skin tone. No, you can have other skills that you stack on top of whatever you were born with. And then you can use those things to social climb or to make it in Hollywood. And so pretending like Ice Spice only has light skin privilege and that's it, that's disingenuous. Ice Spice is pretty, and she does have pretty privilege, obviously, because pretty privilege means you have a societal advantage by fitting into the beauty standards of your culture. So Ice Spice is a part of, you could call it the hip hop culture. Some people will say she's not a part of black culture. Okay, fine. So she's a part of hip hop culture, though. So for the person that said, oh, she's only getting hyped up because she has a big butt, well, that is one of the beauty standards in hip hop culture. It's having kind of this hourglass Coke bottle shape. So once again, that's not light skin privilege, that's pretty privilege. She has a pretty body shape, and so she is receiving praise for her body shape. That's called pretty privilege. This one says, I saw a video about someone called Mariah the Scientist recently and was shocked at how bad her performances are. I've heard a lot of complaints about Sweetie, but this was quite surprising. I don't follow these people, but I do know that it would not be forgiven if a darker-skinned artist was a similarly poor performer. So once again, you're calling something colorism that's based on a hypothetical. There is no dark-skinned artist who is a bad performer that I can think of, or at least you're not naming an actual example of an actual current dark-skinned rapper who has poor performances like Mariah the Scientist and Sweetie. So once again, you're calling something colorism based on a hypothetical. It's based on something that did not happen. So you're just saying if she were a dark-skinned woman, she would have had it harder. Is that not colorist in and of itself? There's not even a dark-skinned artist out right now that is a bad, like the worst performer ever. And so you didn't even have an actual example. You're saying that hypothetically, if a dark-skinned woman would have done the same thing, she would have been screwed. She would have been booed off stage, or she would have had it worse. Okay, but that didn't happen though. That's not what's happening right now. So once again, you're talking about something that is a hypothetical, and now you are putting the term colorism on it. Or you're trying to say that not receiving as much criticism is a form of colorism, or that you have light skin privilege because you're not as criticized as somebody who's darker than you. But once again, let's look up the definition of light skin privilege. It's talking about relative advantages that racial minorities who are recognized as light skin receive when navigating predominantly white spaces. So at these women's concerts, Sweetie and Mariah the Scientist, are they navigating a predominantly white space at their own concert? No. The majority of the people who are in their audiences at their concerts are people of color. Oh, they have light skin privilege because they didn't receive as much criticism. Receive criticism from who? Their black audience? Because once again, remember, light skin privilege applies when you're navigating through white spaces. So you can argue that light skin privilege is true like in Hollywood and stuff because Hollywood is owned by white men. So, but remember, by admitting that, you're also admitting that white men prefer mixed race women or lighter skinned women. So that kills that whole divester talking point of nobody wants you if you're mixed race, or nobody wants you if you're light skinned. White men don't want you. So just remember that you're killing off the divestment talking points by supporting that. But someone not receiving as much criticism or not receiving a lot of criticism, that, in my opinion, is not light skin privilege because number one, their audience is not white people. Their audience is majority women of color. And then number two, one of these women, Mariah the Scientist, isn't even famous enough to really receive the same level of criticism as artists who are bigger than her. This person says, I think the colorism aspect comes from the actual promoters, studios, and labels. Okay, that's a fair criticism. They said people consume what is put out there for them. Okay, so, but then whose fault is it? It's the consumer's fault for supporting colorism by watching people who are, not their phenotype, supporting artists who are not their phenotype, and then getting mad when their phenotype is not represented. I know that for me personally, as a consumer, when I'm listening to music, I've always been this way where I watch movies and stuff and listen to music with women who look like me. If a woman doesn't even look like me, I tend to be less interested in that. So, where unambiguous women make the mistake is they will try to throw light skinned women in and out of being brown skinned, unambiguous black women. They do this all the time. And then once those women profit off of the black community and that woman becomes super famous and successful, like Beyonce, then suddenly they say, oh, she only got to where she is because of light skin privilege. You know damn well Beyonce didn't only get to where she is because of her skin tone. You like her singing, you like her music, you like her production, you like her performances. A lot of women who don't look like Beyonce wish that they look like Beyonce, and they live vicariously through Beyonce's phenotype, but then suddenly you want to make the argument that this girl is only where she is because of her skin tone. And it's like, no, the way that marketing and economics work is based on supply and demand. So even the record label owners, yes, you can absolutely go against that record label. Stop listening to artists who come from these colorist record labels. So don't complain about colorism in one breath, but then you still listen to music from colorist record labels. Because the way these record labels work is based on supply and demand. If they know that a lot of unambiguous women want to look like ambiguous black women, then that's what they're going to continue to supply, because they know this is going to make us money, because unambiguous black women, they like to promote ambiguous black women. So let's keep promoting what they want, supply and demand. Let's promote what they want, and then we can make more money off of it. So it's both of you guys' fault. It's the label, like the colorist labels and promoters and studios, but it's also the consumer's fault for continuing to give their money and their time and their attention to ambiguous black women over unambiguous black women. And I've noticed a lot of them blame black men, and I do think black men are to blame as well, but black men on average, they don't have enough social power to really like promote all of these people like how you think they do. It's really white men and the consumers. So if you have smoke, bring the smoke to the white men record label owners. And by the way, I've got some screenshots of the people who own the industry. I've got screenshots of what they look like. Let me pull them up. So this is what they look like. The people who dominate the music industry. These are people who they own the record labels and stuff, the studios and the promotions. Okay, so these are white men for the most part. And so they obviously favor the Ice Spice type of phenotype, or, you know, if you guys want to argue that all of these men are colorists, okay, so then send a message to these people by refusing to support these colorist labels. So don't complain about colorism in one breath and then you support colorist record labels and songs in the next breath. I've noticed another thing that people will call light skin privilege is they'll be like, oh, Lil Wayne and all these rappers, they said they want a long hair, thick red bone, or they talk about a light-skinned woman being pretty in a song. Once again, that is simple pretty privilege. That's a woman being complimented for her beauty, regardless of her skin tone, has pretty privilege. I don't know why in the unambiguous community they seem to conflate light skin privilege with pretty privilege, but there are dark skinned women who have pretty privilege. They have been complimented in songs before. I've heard songs talking about dark skinned girls or chocolate skin tones and stuff. So that, in my opinion, that's just pretty privilege. Somebody complimenting your beauty, that's a form of pretty privilege. Somebody making a song or writing a song about how beautiful you are. Once again, that's pretty privilege. Also, a lot of people act like there are not dark-skinned women who are not that talented, but they are able to make money because they're pretty. So there are dark-skinned women who profit off pretty privilege and nothing else all the time. Look at this comment here. She said, I agree that Ice Spice in particular isn't that talented, but her blowing up is probably attributed to more than just her being light. Exactly. She also has the BBL body, not saying she has one, but thick is being shoved down our throats right now, so light skin, willing to be sexy, and has curves. She checks all the industry boxes. It's not just light-skinned women benefiting from the body and beat face trend. There are darker women who ain't talented and still get clout, and it's because they went and got their body done, or they have it natural, make themselves fit the look, and are willing to be sexy. This ain't just a light skin problem. A lot of women are getting away with it right now. Exactly. Anybody can have pretty privilege, but unambiguous black women, they shoot themselves in the foot because they only talk about how much pretty privileged light-skinned women have. And it does make a lot of them ruin their collective image because they're constantly talking about how so-and-so, she gets more compliments and she gets all this praise on social media and she gets called pretty more often, or all these rappers are talking about how pretty she is. And it's like none of that had anything to do with light skin privilege. That's not even the definition of the phrase light skin privilege. You're using the wrong terminology. The correct terminology is pretty privilege. But has anyone else noticed this? Like how a lot of people, when you ask them to describe light skin privilege in the Black community, they will begin describing pretty privilege with the women in particular. What do you ladies think? Let me know in the comment section and I'll talk to you next time. Stay pretty, ladies.